Thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you.
Very good.
Yours.
So thank you everyone for being here today. It's very exciting for me to share with you all some of the findings from my dissertation work. So what happened, it was a few decades ago. I worked in Peru for about 10 years in this area, in the Selva Central of central Peru, at the same latitude as Lima. This area is on the eastern slope of the Andes, where the Andes meet the Amazon basin. And I worked for many years there with indigenous organizations and different projects. And then after years of coming here, getting my master's, I returned to the area, and I was surprised by the recovery that I noticed in some of those forests and some of those hills that used to be very highly deforested. And I was wondering what's happening, what's driving those changes. So I went to the field in May, in the summer of 2016, for a preliminary research visit, and I was finding links between this behavior, eco-friendly behavior, with the coffee certification standards, with cooperative. And although these folks, the migrants, the Andean migrants, are seen in this area as some of the worst enemies of conservation on the forest, I have been noticing that there's something different, something worth to be, some story to be told and to be shared. So today I'm gonna be sharing some of the findings from my second chapter of my dissertation, which is based on what is driving these changes. Like, first from the policy and the market, how these larger factors are influencing the change in practice of these folks. And my next chapter, which I'm not going to be presenting today, is looking at what are the intra-household factors that lead these changes, taking into consideration the larger background, the larger environment. And my next chapter will be looking at how these folks are reacting to this, if they are actually meeting what they expected, and if they do or they don't, if they can keep their intent to continue to maintain or to suspend this practice. So there, let's go get started. The objective of this presentation of the research is to look at how the changing social, political, and economic circumstances are affecting the evolution of the adoption of agroecological practices by smallholder coffee farmers. I use this research question to guide the research, my work, and I use a number of methods I use to collect information to answer these questions, both qualitative and quantitative, and based on primary sources such as interviews and informal conversation, as well as secondary sources like information that I gather from the organization itself, from the literature, and some governmental and development agency. I use the farmer household economic framework to try to make sense of what's happening in this context. According to this framework, these farmer households make decisions based on their utility maximization, so they're trying to maximize the benefits that they get, considering risk and uncertainty on their context, and also responding to the variables that are at the market and the policy level. This is like a larger representation of how I can intend to analyze the results. Like you see, there's several levels, from the international to the individual household or farm manager at the bottom. And all of these are linked to each other. And at the bottom, we see at the core, these agroecological choices are made based on how these folks read their environment, how they read what's going on in their context. both in the international all the way to the household level. And they base this also in several factors that are affecting their perception, which is some are like their age, their education, their cultural background, and other ones. So then the choices that they make affect both their livelihood outcomes and environmental outcomes. And these outcomes also have a feedback effect on their own agroecological choices. And that kind of keeps going on and on. Okay. This is the area that I did my research on central Peru. This is called the Selva Central. It's again on the eastern slopes of the Andes at the same latitude as Lima. The farms are located between 500 and 1800 meters in mountain cloud forests. And in this area, most of the people that live are migrants from the Andes, mestizos from the Andes that moved in the last few decades. But this is also the native lands of Ashanika indigenous communities, which are not that represented in the cooperative that I will be talking about. So most of the participants in my study are migrants from the Andes. And here are some of the results. So first, I'm gonna show what I found, what are the factors that make these folks to migrate in the first place. Because these folks come from the high Andes. And what are the factors that push them or force them out of the area of origin? And what are some factors that attract them to the Selva Central region? In the literature of migration, we use this term, the push and pull factors. And we're going to go over some of those, the most relevant. One of the most important push factors was poverty and ecological degradation in the Andes. These areas have been suffering from rapid demographic growth, which led to the fragmentation of the agricultural lands and also the low profitability of the agriculture that these folks were doing in this area. Persistent droughts and frosts also affect their livelihoods, and they have been a process of switching from agriculture, which was a more labor intensive that provided jobs for many of these farmers, to extensive cattle ranching, which requires less amount of labor. Therefore, many of these folks found themselves unemployed. So this is one of the most important reasons that drove people of the Andes into the Amazon. The price and sustained demand of coffee was also one of the most important factors that attracted these folks to arrive on the first place to the Selva Central. It is known that the price is probably the most influential factor of coffee, and we can see through history that since the 1880s, the sustained growth of the coffee market actually coincides with a search of governmental policy to promote colonization. So the government was also trying to take advantage of the prices and promoting people to migrate to develop this area. And we also see some times, like in the 1960s, that the drop of coffee prices led to the failure of some of the larger coffee states and the restructuring of the land tenure system. There were a number of policies that intended to promote colonization in this area, such as the construction of roads and social projects. In the beginning, in the 1880s, these policies intended to favor European colonies at the time. And the conditions that the government and the policy and the market produced also were favorable for Andean migrants to start coming kind of through the back door, because they were not receiving all the benefits that were given to European migrants. And of course, the roads and infrastructure were the most influential policies that allowed this migration to happen. In the early official discourse of the government was to promote colonization and in order to help economic development in the area, as well as to maintain an active presence of the state in these frontier regions. The native population at this time, they were seen as a barrier to development. Some of that still happens today. And the solution of the state was to promote the colonization by European migrants, which in their eyes were more suitable than the Peruvian nationals. But then things changed, and during the 20th century, the official discourse switched to promote Andean migration to these Amazonian lands. The government was trying to mitigate the socioeconomic crisis in the Andes while also appeasing the social movements that were growing in the Andes against the government. President Fernando Belaunde was very famous to promote migration and decolonization in the Amazon under his motto, the conquest of Peru by the Peruvians. And he was very famous for promoting a network highway that we call La Marginal de la Selva. It was like a parallel highway on the Amazon. I mean, it was parallel to the Panamericana Highway. What are migration channels? These are established systems which allow people to migrate from one area of origin to the area of destination. So there was this migration channel from the Andes to the Selva Central. It started becoming more frequent, more common during the 1850s. And these were promoted by wealthier, larger state-owned landowners. At this time, Satipo, the area of where I did my research, was not colonized yet because roads didn't get that far in. But earlier frontier regions have been already occupied and utilized by these large estate owners. The system was called enganche, was like hooking somebody. And what it means is like these peasants receive money up front to leave their area of origin in the Andes, and they were transported to the area of work in the Selva Central to work, mostly through the harvest season. And at the end, they were released, they were paid, and these folks were pretty much kept as slaves. They were not allowed to leave the area. But this system was becoming very common in the area, so medium and smallholder producers also adapted this system to serve their own interests and the secure labor force for their own funds. Most of these folks were seasonal workers, but with time and when the conditions were right for them, they started to settle in the area more permanently. And these coffee farms also required workforce to cover their own needs. So these folks who came following the medium or the large state owners and stayed on their own terms, they also need work for their own farms. So they created like a ripple effect of migration, a massive migration from the Andes to the Selva Central. Some of the factors that affect land selection. So we already have a mass of Andean migrants that have arrived to the area. Mostly are impoverished folks with limited education and limited economic and political power. So they were looking for areas to produce coffee in the first place. And at that time, when they arrived, most of the most valuable flatlands and that were closer to the roads were already taken by more powerful individuals that were mostly dedicated to cattle ranching and fruit production. So Andean poor farmers ended up finding areas for colonization in the mountains, 2 or 3 days walking distance from the roads. So these higher and isolated areas proved to be pretty good for having pretty good characteristics such as elevation and soil fertility for the development of coffee. However, the combination of high slopes and the heavy rainfalls that regimes that were in this area made this area vulnerable for erosion and so loss of soil fertility. Okay, what I found is that some of the motivations for these folks to adopt certain practices were basically economic, both short and long term, what were the expected returns, economic returns from their work, and a cultural identity was gradually developing in these folks. That although they came from a different area and realized that in the new region that they are working, the ecological practices have a different effect on the environment and on their own livelihoods. So both of these are the most important motivation for them to adopt certain practices, both economic and related to their cultural identity. Some factors were linked to this decision, which are the benefits that they expect from cooperative membership, also some benefits from participating in specialty coffee programs and in certification schemes. I'm going to talk a little more about that in a little bit. Also, empirical and training-based learning help these producers to make sense, to make connections between the agroecological practices that they adopt and the effects on both their livelihoods and their environments. What I mean by empirical learning is what they learn through experience, talking to each other, what's happening with certain practices with their environment, if there's some landslides because they didn't protect well some slopes, or what they are learning from their neighbors. This as well as training based, which is mostly training carried out by the cooperative, government organization, and also international organizations. Some of the most important short-term economic benefits are related to the expectations of higher prices, higher yields, and lower cost of production. So overall, more profitable agriculture. For example, some specialty coffees can reach higher prices up from $370 per kilo to $770. While the regular price they could get at the cooperative or the street is like $1 an acre. So it's a substantial gain. The organic certified coffee also is assumed to provide them with a certain premium over the basic price, something between 0.06 and 0.15 per kilo of coffee, but this often doesn't reach the producer for several reasons that we will not cover. So different methods of production of specialty organic coffee or the non-organic coffee also have an effect on the cost and yield structures. And the combination of practices that these folks decide to adopt play an important role in the expected short-term economic return of coffee production. Then also the long-term economic benefits that these folks expect play a very important role on the adoption of practices. So some of the ways these folks expect to improve the value of their land is to improve the soil fertility and conservation, also to grow some valuable trees and other products, and to reduce both livelihoods and environmental risks. And these practices that result in an increased value for the farm property are more appealing for those folks who can perceive these connections as beneficial and they have the means to do it, both in economic terms, in capital and labor, basically. Some of the practices that improve soil fertility and conservation were terrace building, the conservation of vulnerable areas such as high slopes or sources of water, maintain adequate fertilization levels, and also maintain appropriate levels of shade cover. In order to increase the long-term value of the farm, they also carry out reforestation in their farm, and they see as a retirement fund. So this is something that they can harvest, collect, and get some income when they are too old to work on coffee. Now we're gonna go over this growing identity as environmentally friendly practice farmers of some of these folks. So during the time that they have experienced the effects of the area and the practices they have adopted, they have been finding out that some practices are perceived as being more environmentally friendly than others. And these 2 decades of experiences their effects, they have found the need to adapt some of these strategies. And these producers have learned that some inadequate practices are causing negative effects both to their livelihoods and to their environment. And we see that trading events are helping some of these folks to connect both the cause and effect relationships between the practices they adopt and the livelihood outcomes. Some of these folks are feeling guilty. They realize that through many years they have caused damage to the environment and that has affected them. So here are some quotes of one of these farmers that tells me that he was feeling pain that he have destroyed this forest. And he's now committed with his family to fix what they have affected. And this increased environmental awareness, as well as the potential economic return that they can see from adopting these practices, are important for the development of a cultural identity as environmentally responsibly coffee farmers. And these are some of the most important practices that they have identified as environmentally friendly. First, reforestation, to limit the use of fire or slash and burn, to ban hunting, and to protect native forest fragments in their farms. So these are like the most common responses when I ask them, do you think you are an environmentally friendly farmer, and why? What do you do in response to this behavior? Here in this table, I've put together some of the agroecological practices that they carry out. And here some of the motivation or the factors that made them comply with certain standards. These are all the information, but I'm breaking this down in the next few slides. So these are some of the factors that motivate or that aggregate practices according to their expected return. For example, being member of the cooperative and certification standards provides certain benefits for these farmers. So some practices are motivated and enforced by the benefits that they expect from being a member of the cooperative and therefore a fair trade certification, the fair trade certification body. This cooperative that I use for my study is fair trade certified, which means that everyone in the cooperative is certified as fair trade. And if they don't comply with the basic standards, they will be removed from the cooperative and from the certification. So being member of the cooperative in this case and following fair trade standards are kind of the same. So these cooperative members expect to have higher prices and more stable prices by being member of the cooperative and participated in the fair trade certification. So, and they have to adopt certain number of practices to maintain their status. Some of the most important benefits include price premiums, trainings, transportation services, and access to productive inputs and tools. Although price premium is very important for these folks, also what they call the price floor. So the minimum price that they will get if they get to sell their coffee at certified. No matter that the price of coffee goes lower than $100 per bag or 100 pounds, they will have a minimum level of price that they can get for their coffee. Then this is another motivation for some farmers to adopt certain practices, the organic certification. So in this case, not everyone in the cooperative follows the organic certification standards. I estimate that 75% of these folks are members, and participate in the organic program, while the rest, the 25% remaining, they have decided to not be organic, or to they have been downgraded to non-organic because they have failed some of the standards. These producers expect higher prices than their non-organic and only fair trade counterparts. On the other hand, the non-organic farmers are not required to follow some of these standards, and such as they don't have to follow this zero tolerance rule to any prohibited synthetic product. These farmers, these non-organic farmers, can use certain number of products that are to be synthetic, but they have to be labeled as low or moderately toxic. Through the time I was there, I was asking people what was going on, why the organic is not working for several, and I was trying to connect dots here, and I found that there was some irregular practices surrounding the organic market. And some of these changes, some of these practices are posing a risk to their efficacy to promote environmental conservation and to support their livelihoods. This is one of them, they call the combos, the combo practice of these certified markets. So buyers request a number of, let's say, 4 or 5 containers of coffee, and they offer, I will only pay you for this high price for this coffee for 1 container. I'll pay you a little less for the other 2, and for the remaining 3, for the other 2, I'm just gonna pay you the basic conventional price. Take it or leave it. So if they are supposed to gain like 10% on top of the regular market, if we divide that 10% by 5, they are really making a very low. These folks find that they don't have much power over the system to go back and say something about it. So they are losing money and they don't seem to know what to do. Also, they have been cases that they report this ghost cooperative, and many cases in which people talk about them. But even some of these have been found by the Fair Trade Certification Agency, and they have decertified some of them. So some coffee buyers or some intermediaries are filing as if they were a cooperative run democratically. So what I learned is that some of these folks include in the roster of members like their neighbor, cousins, the driver, or other people, and they register them as if they were a cooperative. And they intend to take advantage of the benefits that are meant for democratically run cooperative. In 2018, FLOSSER, which is the agency that oversees certification of fair trade, they decertified 4 cooperatives, accusing them of this practice. And these organizations are undermining the market for this certified coffee, as well as the trust for both international buyers and consumers. And this price is driving the local price of coffee, the price that reaches these farmers, a lot lower often than the cost of production. And also, I found that there is this irregular market for blind certificates. So certain cooperative organizations plan, or they write in their documents that they will produce a certain amount of coffee, let's say 50 containers, but they know they are not going to reach that level, so they only produce 30. So they have paperwork to certify 20 more containers. And what happens, some of these folks are selling the blank certificate in an illegal market. And those unused cooperatives often end up in the hands of this ghost cooperative, and these folks buy the paper from one hand and go to the street and buy cheap coffee from the other hand, and they match them. Doesn't always happen, but that's it. So some of these problems are causing that organic production doesn't work for everyone. So this small price difference, the higher production cost, and the lower yields that derive from following these practices to become organic are driving some of these farmers off the certification and the practices that they motivate. So some folks say that this organic coffee is not sustainable for them anymore, and they have to do something different. And also, there's a limited capacity of the market to absorb all the certified coffee. Some say that even sometimes it's 7 times smaller than the supply of certified coffee. And I met this farmer that he arrived at the cooperative office with 30 quintals of coffee, and they find out that they were not buying anymore. So they can just leave it there and wait until they can sell it, or they can go to the street and sell it to anybody that wants to pay whatever money they get, so they can return the money. On the other hand, this is a new alternative to some of these certified markets, is the rise of the gourmet specialty market, which is becoming a very interesting alternative for these folks, for some of these folks. These coffees can be sold for a significantly higher price, sometimes many times more, but the conditions are very particular to be able to produce this higher quality and taste. This elevation has to be above 1,300 meters. So those who are between 500 and 1,300 are going to have a very difficult time to produce the level of quality that is required for these markets. Also, they have to use certain type of varieties that often are more vulnerable to diseases and produce lower yields. This production also requires specific harvest and post-harvest processes that need some training and supervision to be done correctly. But they have found that even in small areas, like 1 or 2 hectares, they can be more profitable than other folks producing more than 10 hectares. So this is an interesting advantage. And that led us to think that if they focus their effort in a smaller area, they can let other areas to regrow, or to regenerate. Here are some of the standards that are required by the cooperative to stay as a member and follow the fair trade certification norms. Is no burning, not using highly toxic products, to use the shade cover appropriately, not hunting, and to conserve water sources. To follow the organic standards, they have to follow a zero tolerance of any synthetic product, including the highly toxic, and do a proper management of the waste product of coffee production, such as the aguas pieles, or like the liquid effluent from coffee processing, as well as the coffee pulp, which if they are not treated and disposed correctly, they can really hurt the environment. Some of the practices that they identify that increase their soil fertility, and that's why they choose to adopt them is the zero tolerance to burning, not using highly toxic chemicals, use certain level of fertilization, shade, conserve water sources, and also practice some soil conservation practices where they are needed. Here are some practices that they consider will increase the farm value, which is this list. Many are the same that we've seen on the other 2 slides. And here are some practices that these farmers associate to their growing cultural identity as environmentally friendly farmers. And that's it. Thank you.